We move voluntarily to feel good, we move to get stronger, we move for peace of mind, and some of us move involuntarily, repeatedly. Hello and welcome to TicFit the podcast, a podcast where we discuss all things movement in both the exercise sphere and in life with Tourette syndrome. This is a platform to discuss Tourette syndrome and its effects on our bodies. We'll speak with movement professionals where we can advocate and educate about Tourette syndrome, while the Tourette community can benefit from the expertise of these individuals. We'll also speak with professionals about Tourette syndrome and other tic disorders. I'm your host, Raquel Cunningham, and I've been on a quest for the past 2 decades to discover the connection between movement, exercise, and our ticking muscles. This is not meant to diagnose or treat Tourette syndrome. There is no cure for Tourette syndrome. We are here to advocate and educate about Tourette through conversation, and anything in this podcast is for informational purposes only. Please always consult with your doctor before beginning any exercise program to make sure that it's right for you. Hey movers, I am so excited today. If you're joining us today from the movement fitness world, you have most likely heard of Juliet Starrett and Kelly Starrett. And you'll get to help us discuss mobility as it relates to different body mechanical puzzles while learning some things about what Tourette syndrome is and what it isn't. And if you're joining us from the Tourette world, you will hopefully have some takeaways about voluntary movement strategies that can help the wear and tear that tics put on our bodies. We have two absolute titans from the movement and mobility world here today. Dr. Kelly Starrett is a doctor of physical therapy and a world-renowned movement specialist. Juliet Starrett is a 3-time world champion whitewater paddler with a 5-time national title holder as well, and a former attorney. And together they both started San Francisco CrossFit, written books like Becoming a Supple Leopard, Deskbound, and their most recent book, Built to Move. They've also created the Ready State, which is a absolute gold mine of movement information. So we have a lot to get into.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, and what the heck? I mean, Juliet always gets to be like 3-time world champion, and Kelly's like,
You're the mobility guy. I have to admit, I didn't even know till recently how much of avid mountain bikers you guys are.
We love it. Kelly has been mountain biking since he was a young kid in Germany where he grew up.
Oh, wow.
And I am a late comer to mountain biking. I didn't learn until I was about 45 years old, which is not easy, by the way. And but yeah, we are lucky enough to just be able to get on our bikes at our house where we live in Northern California and just go straight out on the trails. So it's just, we've fallen in love with it.
What I will say though is, one of the things that we're trying to help people remember is that the gym is a great place to train and uncover holes and deficits, but the goal is to go out and have their body that's built for adventure. And I think we want to see the gym as a laboratory and a place, again, where we can be vulnerable and explore and play, but the real play and the real gold is outside. So, I mean, mountain biking is one of our favorite ways of reminding ourselves that sunshine is important, and so are friends.
Couldn't agree more. We have some really amazing trails by where I'm at too. I dabbled in mountain biking a little bit, but I still have a fear of going downhill. I'll tackle anything uphill, but the downhill, that's a different beast for me. Okay, so talking about Tourette syndrome and movement, the biggest thing here is that people with Tourette and tic disorders have compensation patterns as unique as their tics. And there's a legitimate concern for the wear and tear that they're going to be living with this on their bodies, and enter a lot of the mobility work that you guys do so that they can go out and resume, an active life without fear of injuring themselves. 2 of your guys' favorite books, Becoming a Supple Leopard and Built to Move. I love Built to Move because I think it takes a lot of experience to edit something down as simply and beautifully as you did in this book. What prompted this one? What prompted this book?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll take an initial swing. We are working, in addition to what we do professionally, which you laid out earlier, we're working parents living in a suburban community in Northern California. We, raising 2 kids around, people who are lawyers and doctors and advertisers and, they're not in the health and fitness world, but they all really want to be healthy. And that means something different to each one of them, but they want to be healthy. And we started having neighbors and friends and people knock on our door and say, hey, what diet should I be following? Should I be intermittent fasting or eating paleo or carnivore or sugar diet or whatever it is? And, coming to us when they threw out their back. And we found that our original book, Becoming a Supple Leopard, which is like a 450-page coffee table textbook.
It's propping up computers everywhere.
It's propping up computers and decorating coffee tables around America. Wasn't really a resource that we could hand out to like our mom and our dad and our neighbors and people who, cared about feeling good in their bodies, but really weren't excited about getting super technical. And so in some ways we thought about Built to Move almost as a prequel to Supple Leopard. Like, this is like start here. And then if you really want to nerd out more on these topics, then you move on to Becoming a Supple Leopard. But yeah, we just felt like we wanted to have a resource. And we also, the second reason is as you mentioned, we own a gym for almost 20 years and we're like, think of ourselves as coaches. We employed many coaches over the years. And what we saw is that coaches often have 1 hour to work with people. But then they people are awake and asleep and doing things for 23 other hours of the day. And we wanted to give a resource to coaches to say, hey, okay, we can do our level best to get you fit and strong in this 1 hour we're working with you in class or in private training or whatever we're doing. But you have 23 other hours of your day, which actually also really matter for your health. And like, here's a playbook for you. So I think those were kind of the two audiences we were going for with this book.
If I might add, one of the things that we recognize is that in the world, people are getting the memo that they should lift a weight and exercise. I think if you ask anyone, like, should you exercise? Everyone's like, yes, of course. Problem is that we felt like the conversations around lifestyle behavior and taking care of your body were really very tightly coupled with that very formal 1 hour exercise prescription. I have to go to a class. It has to be very formal. And that didn't really reach out to a lot of people who say, maybe I like to play or I like to dance or I like to walk. And I'm not identifying as a self-exerciser. What we want to do is say, hey, look, we know we have, at one point recently in our lives, we had 3 women who were over 100 years old, and never had they ever done a high intensity exercise or keto or laid on a red bed or taken a mitochondrial supplement. In fact, they were like smoking until they were 90. So
and having martinis.
Right. So what we realize is that the body is very durable, and yet there are certainly best practices that we can deploy around nutrition and range of motion and sleep, that if we could get people leveled up, that was really a conversation that was sort of agnostic from exercise. And so we wanted to give people a template to say, hey, here's what we're learning from high-level sport and high-level competition, where we might understand what our best practice is and what's the evidence say now, but how do we start to say, how do we improve our families, our households, when it's not just about exercise? And then just to echo what Juliet said, many people on this call are deep exercise and fitness nerds. And they are getting very sophisticated about taking care of themselves, but they have an auntie, they have a cousin, they have a nephew, they have how do we expand what we're learning? And by creating this book, not only was it a resource for coaches, but also we felt like, hey, we know that you're fitness curious neighbor or auntie, and you want to lose some weight and feel better in your body. Here's a great place to start. And it doesn't have to be as complex as you need to go to a CrossFit gym and learn a whole nother, I'm not going to go just jump into Pilates because someone said I should, take care of my body. That's a big ask for people. And if we can begin to synthesize some really simple behaviors, lo and behold, we can transform our society and, more importantly, transform our communities and our streets.
That makes so much sense. I think something that happens in the Tourette world too is people learn to live with their tics, no matter what they are. Tics can be complex, they can be simple, but you almost have to push them off to the side just to go about your day with what you need to do. And there's really been no big formal studies about the effect of exercise on tics, but anecdotally, there's such a high drive saying that helps. But we still have to account for the wear and tear, even if we push the tics aside, the wear and tear that it does on our bodies. So I love Built to Move because they are simple habits. They're simple assessments that you can do to make sure that you're still moving well. Even on the jacket,
cover. And as you just mentioned, you talk about a durable human. I think the Tourette community is the most durable humans.
Absolutely.
The things that they have to endure and go through and still move through, like, we're a durable population here. But
yeah, I would say that, talking about having to undo, things that are happening to your body or compensations. I also think there are a lot of comparisons that come to mind. We work with Kelly in particular has worked with a lot of military communities. We've worked with law enforcement, and lots of other communities who are, forced into positions at work, for example.
Even our adaptive athletics program.
Yeah, adaptive athletics program, where, we obviously became known as like the standing desk people over the years, right? We really encouraged a lot of people to stand and move more at work. And we would often have people come to us, well, I have a job that requires me to sit all day. I'm a police officer. I need to be in my squad car for the whole day. And, to those people and to your community, what I would say is that's okay. You're like, it's not, you're going to have some wear and tear on your body, but there's so much you can do at home on your living room floor to kind of undo that while you're watching Netflix. So many of the mobility practices that we recommend are really simple, really accessible. All you need is like a simple foam roller and a lacrosse ball. It's a small investment, and you can do so much to sort of undo some of this wear and tear on your body that comes from all sorts of things by just sitting on your floor and kind of taking a crack at working on your tissues a little bit.
And if we even took the position that wear and tear sometimes maybe isn't even the right phrase. It's a comfortable phrase, but I have this body that's built to be 100 years old. And if I repeatedly engage in a behavior, tic is behavior, where I have a pattern, my body's just going to adapt and make that pattern more robust, which means that things where, hey, my neck gets a little bit short, or I find I have tension in my jaw, that doesn't even necessarily signal that I have trauma or damage, but my body has adapted to that high speed, repeated load. And to Juliet's point, not to diminish the psychological complexity of living with a tic or Tourette's, if we demystified it and said, hey, you're repeating this pattern over and over again, what is your plan to soften that, to restore blood flow, to get tissue sliding, to break tone? And I don't think, to Juliet's point, is that it can be really empowering and also life altering that, if you're prone to headaches because you're clenching or your shoulder goes up, or you have so many tools to apply that we've learned from sport. And what's unique about, as you said, every tic, every adaptation is individual. It's not that complicated once you develop a set of patterns and tools. If I take this percussion gun and hit my front of my shoulder in the evening, my shoulder doesn't ache as much. And it doesn't even mean trauma, right? Injury. It means, hey, my body is adapting to these movements, these high-speed movements, and protecting me. And now I need to go and see if I can restore my range of motion, get these tissues some better blood. And oftentimes it's amazing how much better we can feel. And we'll just start with our simple assumption. When people feel better, they live better lives. They are better partners. They want to go play. And if something hurts, man, that is a bummer, especially when you feel like I'm never going to get out of this, or this is my jail for the rest of my life, is to deal with this adaptation. And that's certainly, we might not be able to change the behavior, but we certainly can change how your body's reacting to behavior.
I agree. I'm all about giving people more tools for their tool belt to feel better, and ultimately to find if there is a way in the movement sphere to have a reduction in tic urge, a reduction in tic intensity, or a reduction in tic frequency. But to really kind of separate each of those, because if you get a reduction in any of those, something's going to feel a little bit better. But the more tools we can have. And then I have discovered myself having tics, diagnosed at 5. Swimming was the biggest thing to help me figure out those separations. I was a water polo player too. And I know you guys have done some work in the water polo world, that finding a way to do soft tissue release with whatever bound up. A tic is a neurological symptom of a disorder, of a syndrome. Basically, it's a symptom of a neurological condition. But if you can release these bound up muscles that are doing this non-purposeful movement, and then start to layer on kind of neuromuscular re-education that might make your body operate in a more, I don't even want to say balanced manner, but to kind of deal with these asymmetries that these compensation patterns are putting on the body. It's a whole lot of verbiage there that I was tripping over, but all of that to say that there are still things to do to help feel better, move better, and live the life that you want to keep living and do the activities that you'd like to keep pursuing.
100%. And to your point, sometimes it can seem a little magical to be saying to people that, hey, if we get you doing some strength training, not just biceps curls in the gym, that's all I'm talking about, purposeful movement training, and we have some really simple tools that are, you're like, there's no way that this can make me feel better. It's that simple that, when people discover how much agency they have around changing how their bodies work, decreasing sensitivity, managing high tone, as to your point, it really is profound, because you're like, I didn't realize that this was so simple and I could do this myself in my home when it works for me, regularly. I don't have to pay another person to put their hands on me. That's really powerful. And I want to share an experience that is in no way commensurate with living with Tourette's or having tics. But for 14 days, a couple of years ago in the pandemic, I had really gnarly hiccups where I had 6 hiccups an hour for 14 days. And it transformed my life in terms of not sleeping and the compensation and the soreness. And so when you reached out, I was like, oh, I have a tiny, tiny glimpse of what it would be like to live with something that I could not control. I had to move out of our bedroom because I would wake Julia up with these, really, really gnarly hiccups. So, the ability for me to say, hey, I know this is something going on in my brain, but I have all these tools to keep me feeling as well as I could. It's really powerful and really resonates with me.
I would just
That's actually a really, sorry, go ahead, Juliet.
I would just add that, our whole mission since we started our company was to empower people to take care of their bodies and give them some education and tools to do that. One of the things that we've noticed over the years is that we're so quick to trigger the medical model. And by that, I mean, we've received 1,000 emails from people who have paragraph after paragraph of, this scan, that scan, this doctor, that doctor, really just like any sort of tweak, ache, pain, they're immediately like, I've got to go immediately down this medical rabbit hole, which often does not solve their problem and ultimately becomes more of a frustration than anything else. And so, we really have tried in our career to let people know there is so much you can do on your own to undo, whatever it is that's happening to your body, just with a little bit of simple understanding. The other thing too is it's not necessarily precious. People want to get really prescriptive about their super special problem that they have. But the human body is like the most complex organism in the world. So it does require a little bit of like creative thinking and sort of paying attention to your own body. So, it's almost like learning a few general principles about how to take care of your body and then being creative enough to apply those principles to whatever issue you're having can be really transformative for people.
And let me add that, one of the things that I think it's easy to do is that when we have adaptations or patterns that are created from tics, we often fail to think that underneath this is the same biologic system that wins Super Bowls and plays water polo, and that we can have healthier tissues. We can have better hydrated tissues. We can make sure that our tissues can handle higher duty cycles, more loading. And that means, how do I de-stress the animal? Well, it turns out, when we have people sleep enough and take almost like a physiologic approach to this, it may not lessen the severity. And it may, because as a rested, less stressed person probably has less severity in some of their symptoms. And simultaneously, if we take the same approach of like, how do I run a marathon and recover? I want to have the healthiest, most bomb-proof tissues. And if I'm not getting enough fiber, if I'm not getting enough nutrients, if I don't have enough protein on board, chances are I'm going to be more susceptible to pain and discomfort secondary to my tick than if, I do follow along with the basic tenets of how does human beings care for themselves. I have to be in good relationships. I need sun. I need sleep. And all of a sudden, what we really talk about is, hey, these are the universal principles that everyone obeys because we're human beings. And in 2.5 million years, we've been on this planet. In the last 10,000 years, it's the same body, everybody. Juliet's a little taller. I'm a little fatter. But the shoulder is still the shoulder. The neck is still the neck. So we really haven't evolved that much. And that means that we know that there are certain principles that really allow human beings to do well.
Agreed. I do want to nerd out a little bit, though. I know a lot of these are general principles, but I have a deep interest in looking at the kinetic chains of a tick, because I think when you look at the kinetic chains and how that is very individualized per tick, you can apply some of these mechanic principles to it.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So when we talk about kinetic chains, I actually kind of want to go to some asymmetries. And both of you, because both of you were white water rafters, right? Do you guys have the same spot or same position on the boat, or do you change around? Are you paddling the same direction time after time?
Well, it's funny that you bring this up. So I paddled on the U.S. canoe and kayak team in addition to the whitewater team. And I paddled canoe on the right side. I was in a 2-person canoe. So my left hand was very high and my right hand was always low. And 11 days a week, 11 times a week, 300 days a year, I was in this repetitive pattern. And I ended up creating a very gnarly neck injury for myself because I was always clenching.
A career-ending neck injury, no less.
Where I had numbness and tingling and couldn't turn my head. And that pattern overload. Now, in retrospect, I was a terrible breather. My nutrition wasn't great. I'm sure my sleep was awful. And I never looked at warming up. I never looked at cooling down. I never looked at how do I take care of this soft tissue chain. And in retrospect, I was like, yeah, I deserved that. I mean, that was completely of my making. And I was counting on my 23-year-old body to be like, it's fine. And we can get away with it for a long time. I think, those of you in your community who are in this family of Tourette's, oftentimes you can buffer these tics for many, many decades. And then all of a sudden you're like, why does my neck hurt now? Because my brain has suddenly said, hey, I can't tolerate this anymore. Or the changes in the tissues have finally gotten to a place where we can no longer manage those adaptations.
Yeah. And in my case, my whitewater paddling career was pretty diverse. So I was moving from side to side, but I came from rowing. I was a high school and then Division I rower at Cal, which is also a one-sided sport for most people. But I was one-sided. I rowed on the starboard side in high school and the port side in college. And so I got like a little bit of a mix. And I really believe that something about that made me a little more durable. I had so many friends in that sport go down with shoulder injuries and back injuries. And I was lucky enough to never do that. And I do think something about, not spending 8 years just rowing on one side was kind of magic for me.
It helped that a little bit. I kind of have this working theory that when it comes to ticking, sometimes pain is a tick trigger. Sometimes it's a result of the tick. But this idea of kind of centrating the joint, which is where mobility comes in. What does that do to lessen tick urge intensity or frequency? And, simple just for demonstration purposes on video here, if someone has a wrist tick where it's constantly, in this position and rotating out to the side, there's a pull out here. So what can we do, knowing the mechanics of a wrist, in a push-up, making sure that we have centrated position around that wrist, and then looking up the chain, how is your shoulder now adapted to that? A lot of it is kind of chasing sensations too. There's a lot of people with like back twisting tics, or I would use a knee flexion tick. Let's say if somebody drives their knee upward and they're rotating almost like a narrow egg beater or a treading in water polo, if you have this narrow treading position where you are flexing the hip and then internally rotating this way, well, then I might advise that person to work on their TFL or their QL. But then the question becomes, where are you feeling that sensation? Is it a contraction of your QL, or is it an eccentric sensation in your TFL? This is where the mechanical body puzzles come in, and why mobility work, and the person has to go through this self-exploration to figure out what makes them feel better.
And to your point, when I love the way you're describing this, most of the tics I see are largely flexion tics, like the pattern, right? That's what I observe. And again, not an expert here, just a physical therapist. But to your point, one of the things that is really powerful about having a movement practice, which could be Pilates, which could be a formal movement practice like yoga, which could be modern complete strength conditioning. I'm not talking about aesthetics and bro body splits. That's not what I'm talking about, right? And as you described, when we remind the brain of different function, and that function may not be my primary pattern or my default pattern, but it is a learned pattern, what we do oftentimes is restore function, normalize tissue loading, and create a more durable, robust pattern. And that actually is no different than what you just described as, hey, I have these kids doing these egg beaters in the pool a lot. And something that we have to keep an eye on is, hey, the reason we squat and deadlift and do all these things is that so the hip can have its control. Because if we just do this one thing, we're going to start to dim lights in the house. And what we're always trying to do is say, hey, look, when we're training for sport, one of the reasons we're training is not just big muscles, not just to be faster, but we're restoring range of motion, and we're normalizing movement that the brain says, hey, I perceive this as safe and non-threatening and accessible. And that's one of the reasons we want athletes to be in these strength conditioning programs. And if I just said tic instead of sport, I would be able to literally go in and say, hey, this is the same application. I want you in some kind of formal movement training that you like to do with your bodies. And again, let me point out Pilates and a great yoga teacher. And it may be insufficient because of your unique patterns and what's going on to be able to put on YouTube and just do a yoga class. Once you're spun up and sophisticated, you may need some education and some training. And by the way, welcome to the rest of the world where we go get coaching and how our bodies move. But somehow, oftentimes when we have a condition or something going on, we think these people somehow don't benefit from strength conditioning. We had an adaptive athletics class at our gym for years that we ran in conjunction with UCSF Medical Center. And the whole host and gamut of cerebral vascular accidents and trauma and congenital issues. And every person has sort of a unique unlocking of their things. But guess what? Every human being squats, and the hip does this, and the shoulder doesn't do that many things. And ultimately, however we're adapting, is still ultimately a person can probably benefit from being strong and having control in their range of motion and doing some soft tissue work that maybe is just simply the opposite of what our pattern is all the time. So, if you have a tic where your shoulder's driving in and that's a stable mechanical position, we know that your tissues are going to adapt. And it may just be that you need to spend some time on a foam roller with your arms out watching TV. And it's that simple. But not knowing that can make you feel better is the thing.
I think getting somebody to feel that is key. You have to feel that release. You have to feel this tissue open up. You tapped on something that I've been pushing for a while too, using the principle of sports specificity and tying that to kind of what the gold standard of treatment for tic symptoms are, which is called CBIT. It's comprehensive behavioral intervention for tics. There's awareness training, there's proprioceptive awareness training, and essentially you're looking for that first motion of your tic sensation and doing the opposite motion. That's a very watered down word of it. But for example, there's a lot of head jerking tics, forward protraction and rotation, maybe even the jaw out to the side. So that first initial sensation would be to throw your chin forward. So a chin tuck, a retraction. But that's where we go into, well, what's the rest of the chain doing? What else can we help with there? So with sports specificity, your body gets really good at doing these tics. So then there becomes a tic specificity. I had a guy who had that shoulder tic, basically like you were describing, where you would throw it forward, internally rotate, and then punch down. It was more explosive on his right side. It hurt more, but he could satisfy it quicker. His left side, he was right hand dominant. His left side took longer to satisfy that and was more annoying and disruptive to him because it took longer to satisfy that. He wasn't as tic specified in his non-dominant side. So then how does that all relate to CBIT, where you're doing the opposite motion? You almost have to use sports specificity inside out and prioritize what you do not want to train. You have to train the antagonistic muscles to your tics.
What you're saying resonates with me completely and is so intuitive. And one of the things that I think gets lost in this conversation of, again, hey, how can I diminish, the severity, the frequency, right? You people in your community, the experts here are experts in that. What I can say is I'm not going to have a neck or a shoulder system that functions optimally unless I'm doing some very fundamental behaviors like hanging. And so what we see is that, hey, I don't need 100 different specific exercises for me. It's just not that complicated. But there are some things that I have to engage with so that the system functions optimally. And the couch stretch, for example, is one of those behaviors that we see that everyone needs to work on. Juliet's laughing because I'm obsessed with hip extension.
Yeah, I mean, I have to interrupt you because the way that I was gonna respond to this when you said the sort of antagonistic movement
Yes.
is Kelly is obsessed with hip extension. And the reason that everybody is lacking hip extension is that we are sitting all the time in hip flexion.
And squatting and exercise biking.
And, right? And then everybody got a Peloton in the pandemic, which is more hip flexion, right? And so what we are all lacking is hip extension, and there cannot be enough hip extension practice in our lives, so that we feel better, can be more explosive in our sports, so that, we have less low back
pain. So that our knees work and our hips
that
work.
Our body does what the body's supposed to be doing. If you spend 12 hours a day sitting in your desk chair with your hip in flexion, regardless of, whether you have Tourette's or any other condition, like you've got to practice the opposite, which is hip flexion. And Kelly's obsessed with this particular move. To the point where this is what we talk about a lot at the dinner table. But that's exactly what I thought of when you were talking about practicing the opposite.
And I love your approach. And I just want to sort of expand on the fact that you're saying, hey, we need to look at the whole chain, which means that let's look at how the whole limb functions and how the whole limb functions with the torso. And that we're never, ever like, hey, I have a front of my shoulder pain. That's the root of the issue. That is, where the rats get in is not where they chew. And to your point, one of the languages that we have adopted is this language called the archetype, that there are fundamental positions and shapes endemic to every human being in any situation. And the shoulder, for example, seems very complex, but it really does 4 things. It goes out in front of me in a range. It goes over my head in a range. It goes out to the side. And guess what? It goes behind me. Of course, the elbow bends, and that suddenly makes it look more complicated. And it rotates, and that suddenly makes it seem more complicated. But I better be touching one of those 4 shapes regularly. Otherwise, I'm not going to have a shoulder that functions very well. And if I had a tic that drove my shoulder in or down, for example, I would say, oh, like you're a bench press specialist. What are we going to do to keep you from benching 300 times a day, where your tissues are going to be like, okay, this is a simpler position for us. And that pain you have in the front of your shoulder is not really related necessarily to your tic. It's related to your tissues saying, hey, you're yanking on this thing. You don't have access. Let's make sure that we can keep an eye on at least keeping as much range of motion as we can. And doing so, and this is the magic, in a discrete, manageable way. So maybe I have to spend 10 minutes in the evening taking care of my tissues specifically to my universal application of my tic. And that's no different than saying, hey, you need to brush or floss underneath that crown you have a little bit more than people don't have that. But if we can get people down to an idea where, hey, in a very discrete amount of time, pretty regularly, you can give some input in on your specific tissues in your thing. And it's maybe only 3 or 4 things that you rotate through that we know would make a big difference. The other thing that I think is important is that we do this with all the teams and all the athletes we work with, is that you begin to understand what your movement minimums are. So if you have a tic or an adaptation, all of a sudden it's difficult to turn your head to the left because you're always shortening on the right. Then you can start to say, oh, I'm way behind on this. And maybe we need to spend a little time on it. If if it's a shoulder issue or a hip issue, you begin to understand some signatures of how your body is adapting. And that allows you to create sort of a baseline for yourself. And then when you start to get off baseline or have symptoms, you can be like, oh, I'm missing hip flexion, or I don't have any shoulder extension. And I know that that's typically not the language of our medicalized treatment approaches to some of these issues, but it can be very, very empowering because it simplifies the body as a really elegant mechanical machine. Of course, it's very complex, but there are positions and shapes that are universal to me. And then I can do something to improve or restore my range of motion so that I feel better in spite of maybe being able to sort of have these tics that are maybe I can't change, but I certainly can change my adaptation to the tics.
It's, I think, why it's so important to help educate, and what I've learned to do for the past 20 years. This is 20 years I've been wanting to do this, and it's finally happening where I get to speak with people like you and other movement professionals. But I've learned to speak the language of movement, both involuntary, both through the PT world and then through just the coaching world, having been a trainer for 15 years now. And speaking the language of movement, we can all start to help figure out what's going to help alleviate pain. Pain is one of the biggest drivers for people to help seek help with their Tourette's and tics. Yeah. And on average, it takes between 3 and 11 years to get diagnosed, to figure out what's going on. And a lot of people are turning to physical therapists, for help. There's pain. What do I do? So, the more we can get these worlds to talk and learn from each other. They actually allowed me to audit the CBIT course. I don't do CBIT. I'm not a medical professional, but when it came time for the practical, I'm like, I've got some ideas for that tic. I've got some ideas for that tic. What about this? Even, a simple, because to have Tourette's, DSM-5 says 2 motor tics, 1 vocal present for a year. So with the vocal tics, that gets interesting because then the diaphragm's involved, or like a snort or a sniffle. What's the opposite of a sniffle? You got it like your hiccups. All of a sudden you have to start doing some soft tissue work to unlock what's been gripping for so long. And it gets very intriguing. I think when we speak the language of movement, both voluntary and involuntary, it's intriguing. It's not entertaining the way that cinema portrays. There's a lot of help and a lot of good that coaches and trainers can help supply for, the 1.4 million people living with Tourette and tic disorder.
I love that.
That's my rant.
You take a systems approach and a multidisciplinary approach. And one of the things that I want everyone to understand is that, yes, go seek a professional's help who, you're getting high level educational training. But then the day-to-day work is actually, we're going to call unskilled. And I don't mean that it's not important, that there's not technique involved, that it's not skillful, but you laying on a ball to release your diaphragm, to improve blood flow, to break tone, to feel good, to relax, doesn't require any professional person. In fact, I like to move as much of this outside the hospital, outside the PT clinic as we can, because it's impossible for a busy working person to go have these sessions. It's already difficult for someone to go to the gym for 3 hours a week. That's a miracle. So now I'm supposed to go see my physical therapist 3 hours a week and see the gym. And I do that in the middle of my workday because that's when I'm available. Impossible. So the more we can say, hey, we're going to shift this into your training, your exercise, your play, and into your living room, now we really start to move the ball forward. And it's really important that we think in those terms, that this has to be in the domain of someone's control. And again, I might need to get some professional help and some education, but as you pointed out, 2 to 11 years is an insane timeline. And simultaneously, boy, I bet there's something we can do now, and it's called, let's take the lessons of high performance and apply them to our own lives.
Completely, which is why we need to talk to you guys, because you have tools for us.
Hopefully.
Very much so. Very much so. even so you mentioned laying on a ball. I actually had Jill Miller on here last week or 2 weeks
Right.
ago. I wasn't sure if you guys talked or if you just both independently said yes, because this is, I mean, kind of an interesting topic to figure out how to manage. I guess the best anybody can do for TS is manage, unless we find some strong correlations that we can actually study this. I think people are getting curious to study, what if we do breath work on tics? How does that help? What if somebody does more a whole body work? People are trying to exhaust themselves so that they don't tic. And I can see, if somebody doesn't know the ins and outs of CrossFit, that might be the first thing that they do. They show up and they're like, just tire everything out so that I physically don't have the capability to tic. There's a really great book by Josh Hanagarny, The World's Strongest Librarian, and that's basically how he manages his tics. He now does jujitsu. He's a jujitsu trainer. Kettlebells were a big thing for him. And I just find all of this fascinating and helpful.
Well, we did not talk to Jill. Jill is a very old friend of ours. We've been friends and colleagues for a long time, but I will tell you that all of us who are in this space are like, oh, look at these turned on people who are like, show me what to do, and let us be partners in this, exploration of your own bodies. I think it really does resonate with us because, I'm like, yeah, your shoulder hurts from doing too much bench press. Less of an interesting, application of someone's thinking to, hey, how can we help you feel better and go to work and manage all of this and not sort of be in chronic pain. I'd be surprised if not every single person is like, I'm in, let's have this talk.
For sure. Question: when did you guys switch from mobility WOD to the ready state? When did that switch happen?
Yeah, I'll take that away. That was in 2019. We started as mobility WOD in 2009, and it was Kelly. The name was Kelly's idea, and at the time, it was so clever. Like we were like, we are the most clever two people ever, but we're so funny, so clever. Because Kelly actually, people don't know this, but he's the person who popularized the use of the word mobility. Before then, mobility was only used in like cell phone plans and wheelchairs. It was not. Nobody said I'm going to go mobilize until Kelly started, throwing it out there into the world. So you're welcome for that, everybody. And then WOD is decidedly a CrossFit term. It stands for workout of the day. And Kelly was like, I'm so clever. I'm going to put mobility in WOD. It's like mobility workout of the day. This is so clever. And over the years,
we were the first WOD.
We were the first blank WOD anything.
Right.
Over the years, some competitors dropped into the market, and there's plenty of space for them. One of them was ROM WOD, one of them was Go WOD. And then on top of that, the WOD thing became this really popular thing. There was soccer WOD and football WOD and faith WOD and sobriety WOD. And so the WOD, the company blank WOD started becoming very saturated. And on top of that, while the CrossFit community was our original sort of core crew, at some point in our business, we really started expanding outside of CrossFit because the things that we talk about are great for CrossFitters, but they're great for anyone with a body, and especially people who want to have a body that feels good. And so we felt like we grew out of the name at some point. So there was confusion. We grew out of the name. We had already begun our podcast in 2018 as the Ready State, sort of as an initial foray in trying to expand out beyond this initial company name, Mobility WOD. And so we switched to the Ready State in 2019. It took us a long time to do it. And we thought maybe it was going to like take our business. We didn't know what to expect. And it was so seamless that I look back and I think, why didn't we do that sooner? Because I think people completely understood why we did it. They understood the reasons. It made more sense to them. I think everybody can think of what being in the ready state from a physical perspective means to them. That's really obvious. We all have a different ready state. We can understand being in a ready state. So the phrase made sense to us. And so, we've been rolling with it ever since.
And I will tell you that the first time we started talking about ready state was in a lecture we did with the Marine Aviation Weapons Tactical Group, which is like Marine Top Gun. Wow. And what we realized was that in that intense school, people cannot eat enough. They're highly stressed. They don't sleep. They don't have good movement practices. They're basically surviving. And if you come in and say to them, hey, you have to do all these things perfectly, otherwise it's a failure. We have, a whole group of people, a cohort of people who are like, oh, that doesn't work. So what do we do? So what Juliet and I like is, how might we control for what we can control for, manage what we can manage, improve what we can improve. And then, by the way, that's probably enough to go be a savage human being. And that, really does resonate with this community, because it does definitely feel like, hey, I don't have any control or agency and I have to do all of these things. Gabapentin is not a long-term strategy for people. So, what we're talking about here is, hey, what can we manage and what can we improve? And probably those small hinges will open enormous doors for you.
That makes sense, because it switched and I didn't even know when it did, but it did all make sense. And anybody that wants to improve how they move, whether you have tics or not, I think you guys are kind of the premier go-to to start learning about their body and applying simple ideas with big results. Truly.
Well, that's very nice of you.
Thank you so much.
And all I'll say is, we are veterans of the Instagram wars, and we're still here, and we're still obsessed with giving people the tools to feel better in their bodies so they can do what the hell they want with their lives and their bodies. That's really the goal, is that we want to take the handbrakes off where we can so that you can live the life you want and do so in a relatively pain-free way. Pain is always going to pop up, everyone. Welcome to being a human being. I was recently teaching at a Berkeley water polo camp, and I had 100 kids there, and I'm like, who's pain-free? And one hand goes up, and that girl's 9 years old, and she's wrapped in bubble tape and probably high on drugs. Let's be honest. The rest of the kids, where every hand goes up, because being uncomfortable and having pain is a feature of being a human, and certainly a feature of a body that we use and count on. So what we've done is really done a disservice to people, because we haven't given them the tools and said, hey, it's okay when you have pain and stiffness and soreness. Here's a set of tools to see if you can do this yourself. If you can't, let's go get some help. And then the rest of the time, what is it you want to do with your body?
That makes sense. And I tell you, like, having been a water polo player, like, the pain points are very different. There's so many obscure movements in water polo that don't transfer to land, that when I stopped playing polo and kind of became a land athlete, that's where supple leopard really did help me. I liked the specifics of it. I had to traction my hip and all the flossing, banded everything just to get my hips to function on land. I was running 9-minute miles, and there was a coach I was working with when I was a trainer in New York City. And with just 2 sessions and actually teaching me how to run, like, no, this is how your hips work on land, he took 2 minutes off my mile time. I ran a 7-minute mile just from him saying, no, this is how you run.
That's unfair.
So thanks, Leo.
Yeah, I mean, this is a non sequitur, but our daughter plays water polo, and I, as I mentioned earlier, was a rower in high school and college. Right. And we did so much running, and it drives me crazy in current water polo that there isn't some running involved in the side training, because I'm like, no matter what, these kids need to load and be out on land, to have a body that adapts for something else besides being in the pool. It's not a thing that's done. Yet
there's time. Bringing things in here. Yeah, I didn't know what my big toe was for. Like, you don't think about your toes in the water, like, unless you're tanning with them. Like,
yeah, it's just a little fin. It's just part of the fin.
Right. It's a flipper, but incredible. I can't thank you guys enough. I feel like there's 52 million things that I could keep talking about here, but I just want to thank you guys for being open to discussing this, because honestly, movement strategies like this for Tourette syndrome really haven't been had like this before. So here you guys are helping to push the envelope with me, and hopefully some people can find some help with the work that you guys have been putting out there as, veteran trainers in this space for a very long time, with being able to cover both ends of the spectrum, technical and then simple but effective. You guys cover the gamut.
Thank you so much for having us. It's so awesome to meet you and learn more about
Likewise.
your community and this awesome and I'm sure really impactful work you're doing. So keep it up.
Always
Thank
just
you.
need one person. We just need one super user nerd, and then there are 2 super user nerds, and then there are 4, and then this is how we change society. So thanks for going first.
Well, thank you guys. We will talk again soon.
Thanks,
Take
everyone.
care. Thank you.
We love providing a platform for sharing ideas about living with Tourette syndrome and other tic disorders. While we strive to keep the content evidence-based, please understand that exercise science, information about Tourette syndrome, and its co-occurring conditions are constantly evolving. The content shared in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. By listening to this podcast, you agree to not use the information as a substitute for professional medical advice or treatment for yourself or your child. As always, consult your healthcare provider before making any medical decisions or starting any treatments related to Tourette syndrome or other health conditions, which also includes mental health. This disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast. TicFit and the podcast team do not take any responsibility for any actions taken based on the information provided. Our goal is to educate, support, and raise awareness, not to diagnose or treat any medical condition. Thanks for listening.